There are wars that end with treaties, and there are wars that end with silence. The Biafra War is usually described as the second kind. Officially, it ended in 1970. But systems don't forget just because the fighting stops. They adapt. And when you look at Nigeria today, the leadership patterns, the fear around division, the persistence of corruption, the punishment of dissent, what you're seeing is not coincidence. You're seeing the afterlife of a war that was never resolved. Before I go any further, I need to be clear about where I stand. I am Igbo. That doesn't mean this story is emotional instead of factual. It means I am not pretending distance from a history that still shapes my life. This is not a grievance piece. It's a structural one. Nigeria did not emerge naturally. It was assembled. Different nations, economies, religions, and political systems were compressed into a single state under British rule. When independence came, the borders stayed. The administrative logic stayed, and the power remained centralized. What did not stay balanced was trust. By the mid-1960s, Nigeria was barely holding itself together. Political power was concentrated at the federal center. Military power followed it. But economic value, especially oil, did not. Oil had been discovered in large quantities in the eastern region and surrounding areas, which meant something very specific. The survival of the Nigerian state depended on controlling regions that could, in theory, survive without it. In 1966, massacres of Igbo civilians erupted in northern Nigeria. Tens of thousands were killed, not in secret, in public. Train stations, markets, streets. Survivors fled east, carrying stories the state never fully acknowledged. And when a government cannot protect its citizens and refuses to reckon with that failure, trust collapses.
This is usually where people start saying, it was complicated, or everyone made mistakes. But from the ground level, it wasn't complicated at all. People were being killed, and they were told to be patient. Once that happens, unity stops being voluntary. It becomes coercive.
In 1967, the Eastern region declared itself the Republic of Biafra. This wasn't a declaration of conquest. It was a declaration of exit. Exit from a system that had failed to protect life. And that possibility, the possibility of exit, is what triggered everything that followed. Because a successful Biafra would not just have changed Nigeria, it would have changed precedent. It would have shown that a people could leave a post-colonial state and retain control of their resources. That was unacceptable, not only to the Nigerian federal government, but to external powers invested in stability over justice.
From a systems perspective, post-colonial borders are treated as fixed variables. Allowing a resource-rich region to secede successfully would have introduced risk across multiple states. The concern was not humanitarian. It was economic.
Britain, Nigeria's former colonial ruler, openly backed the federal government. Weapons flowed, diplomatic cover followed, and when starvation became visible, when children began dying on camera, the support did not stop. Other global actors aligned with this position, not because they cared about Nigeria's internal unity, but because a centralized state was easier to negotiate with than a disciplined breakaway one. The blockade that followed was devastating. Food became a weapon. Airspace was closed. Aid was restricted. Over 1 million people died, most of them children. This was not an accident. It was a strategy.
And this is where people like to keep the story, at tragedy, because tragedy doesn't require accountability.
But we can't stop there, because what emerged after the war matters just as much as what happened during it. Nigeria declared, no victor, no vanquished. But what followed was not healing, it was containment. The war did not end in reconciliation, it ended in redesign. A redesign that centralized power further, punished economic independence, and normalized corruption as a governing tool. That system didn't disappear with time, it matured. Today, Nigeria still operates within that post-war architecture. Corruption is not an exception, it is a feature. And it continues to benefit external interests. European corporations through extraction and legacy contracts, American interests through energy security and geopolitical alignment, Asian partners through manufacturing, infrastructure, and resource access negotiated at elite levels. None of this requires a healthy state. It only requires continuity. Act 1 is not about grief, it's about architecture. The architecture of a country designed to hold itself together, even if it meant never healing the wound that made holding necessary. In Act 2, we're going to open the files, the policies, the post-war decisions, the economic resets. Because once you see how the war was converted into paperwork, you stop asking why it still governs the present. Wars don't truly end when the shooting stops. They end when decisions are made about who gets restored and who does not. In Nigeria, after 1970, those decisions weren't debated publicly. They were processed quietly, through policy, through law, through administration. And the result was not reconciliation, it was containment. The federal government announced the phrase that would become history's shield: no victor, no vanquished. It sounded humane, but reconciliation requires restoration. And what followed instead was economic punishment without acknowledgement. Igbo bank accounts across Nigeria were frozen. When they were reopened, each Igbo person received a flat amount, £20. It didn't matter what you had before the war. Traders who financed entire markets, families who held generational wealth, professionals who had savings meant to rebuild, all flattened to the same symbolic sum. This wasn't bureaucratic error, it was policy.
From an institutional standpoint, this represents selective economic nullification. Capital accumulation tied to a specific population was erased without individualized review. The outcome was not short-term hardship. It was long-term political and economic repositioning.
Property followed the same logic. Homes abandoned during the war were classified as abandoned property. Many were seized. Many were reassigned. Very few were returned. There was no mass restitution. There was no truth process. The war ended. The consequences did not.
This is where people ask, why didn't the region bounce back? Because systems don't bounce, they lock.
While Igbo economic power was being reset internally, Nigeria's external relationships stayed intact. Oil contracts were honored. Extraction continued. The same centralized structure that had been defended during the war was now reinforced through revenue control, and corruption became the lubricant that kept everything moving. Corruption didn't destabilize the system, it stabilized it. Decisions were negotiated through elites, not institutions. That made Nigeria predictable, not for its citizens, but for foreign partners. European corporations benefited through legacy extraction agreements. American interests benefited through energy security and geopolitical alignment. Asian partners benefited through infrastructure projects, manufacturing access, and long-term resource contracts negotiated at the top. None of these arrangements required accountability, only continuity.
Let's be honest. A transparent Nigeria would have been inconvenient.
Exactly. Transparency would have meant renegotiation. Accountability would have meant redistribution. And redistribution would have meant confronting the war's unresolved outcomes. Corruption allowed everyone to move forward without ever looking back.
In systems analysis, corruption often functions as an informal governance layer. While destructive internally, it reduces uncertainty for external actors. This explains its persistence across decades.
This is why Nigeria never truly restructured after the war. Federal power remained centralized. Resource control remained detached from production regions. Regions associated with autonomy were politically deprioritized, and dissent became increasingly dangerous. From this point on, the message was clear. Economic independence would not be tolerated. Fragmentation would be punished. Silence would be rewarded. This logic didn't disappear with military rule. It carried forward into civilian governments. It hardened.
Which is why when people talk about modern crackdowns, they're not anomalies.
They're enforcement. Enforcement of a boundary drawn in 1970 and never renegotiated. The war didn't just decide territory. It decided who could ask questions. Act 2 is about understanding that the war didn't end. It changed form. Guns gave way to paperwork. Violence gave way to policy. And corruption became the glue that held the post-war order together. In Act 3, we move away from institutions and into the body, because unsolved systems don't stay abstract. They get inherited. When wars are unresolved politically, they don't disappear, they migrate. Out of institutions, out of documents, and into people. This is the part of the Biafra story that never made it into official history, because bodies don't require permission to remember. During the Biafra War, starvation wasn't accidental. It was prolonged, enforced, predictable. Food was restricted, aid was blocked, borders were sealed for months, then years. The human body does not experience prolonged starvation as a temporary crisis. It experiences it as existential threat.
Under sustained threat, the nervous system shifts from regulation to survival. Stress hormones remain elevated. Growth pathways are suppressed. The body learns to conserve, to brace, to anticipate loss. When this state persists, it becomes baseline.
Baseline is what matters. Because once survival becomes baseline, it stops feeling like trauma. It feels like normal. It feels like personality. It feels like culture. Survivors of Biafra rebuilt their lives while braced. They worked harder, saved obsessively, trusted cautiously, not because they were naturally anxious, because their bodies had learned what happens when systems collapse.
This is where people misunderstand entire communities. They call vigilance paranoia. They call independence selfishness. They call emotional restraint coldness. But they're looking at survival strategies and judging them as flaws.
Modern science gives language to what survivors already knew. Epigenetics shows that extreme stress can alter how genes express, not changing DNA itself, but changing which switches turn on. Hunger, fear, displacement. These experiences can recalibrate stress responses across generations.
In populations exposed to famine and prolonged threat, stress response genes may become hypersensitive. This can manifest as heightened vigilance, rapid stress activation, and difficulty returning to calm. These traits are adaptive in dangerous environments. They become burdens when danger is unresolved but invisible.
And this is where Nigeria's post-war failure becomes biological, because there was no truth process, no restoration, no acknowledgement proportional to the harm. The state moved on. Bodies did not. When people ask why the Biafra conversation keeps resurfacing, this is why. You cannot starve a population and then demand emotional amnesia. You cannot erase wealth, silence memory, and centralize power and expect the body to feel safe.
And this connects directly to today, because a population shaped by unresolved trauma does not respond well to intimidation. It responds with quiet defiance.
Which is why fear-based governance never fully works. It suppresses action. but it deepens conviction. I want to say this clearly. I am Igbo, which means I inherited more than stories. I inherited a nervous system shaped by people who lived through starvation, displacement, economic erasure, enforced silence. That does not make me broken. It makes me adapted.
From a biological perspective, this is not pathology. It is continuity. The issue arises when adaptation is never allowed to relax.
And that's the cost of unresolved war. It doesn't just distort politics. It lives in families, in parenting styles, in work habits, in the inability to rest without guilt, in the instinct to build parallel systems instead of trusting centralized ones. Act 3 is about understanding that Biafra didn't just scar history, it recalibrated bodies. And when bodies remember what states refuse to acknowledge, silence becomes unstable. In Act 4, we're going to talk about that silence, how it's enforced, who it protects, and why fear has become a governing tool. Silence is often mistaken for absence, but in post-war states, silence is usually designed. It doesn't mean people forgot. It means they learned what happens when they speak. After 1970, Nigeria did not create a national truth process. There was no official accounting of the massacres, no reparations proportional to the loss, no structural reckoning. Instead, the state chose containment. Silence became policy.
This is the part that confuses outsiders. They assume silence means acceptance, but silence can also mean calculation. When the cost of speaking is high enough, quiet becomes rational.
Over time, Nigeria perfected this balance. Enough freedom to function, enough fear to prevent fragmentation. Dissent wasn't erased, it was managed. This is why modern prosecutions tied to separatist speech are not isolated events. They are signals. Signals meant to reach far beyond the individual on trial. The message is consistent. The question of division is closed. Reopening it will be costly. Fear is an acceptable instrument of governance. This is deterrence.
In unresolved post-conflict systems, deterrence often replaces dialogue. Legal mechanisms become tools for risk suppression. This maintains order. It does not produce legitimacy.
And while this fear stabilizes politics internally, it does something else externally. It preserves access. Nigeria's current structure, centralized power, elite negotiation, limited accountability, remains highly functional for foreign interests. European corporations continue to benefit through abstraction and legacy agreements. American interests benefit through energy security, defense partnerships, and geopolitical alignment. Asian partners benefit through large-scale infrastructure, manufacturing access, and long-term resource contracts negotiated at elite levels. None of these arrangements require a fully accountable Nigerian state. They require predictability.
Silence keeps contracts clean.
Exactly. A loud reckoning would force renegotiation. Transparency would disrupt access. Accountability would demand redistribution. Silence protects the arrangement.
From a systems standpoint, this represents stability optimized for external stakeholders. Internal harm is treated as an acceptable cost.
This is why corruption persists. Not because Nigeria doesn't know how to govern, but because corruption allows decisions without scrutiny, access without reform, profit without accountability. It benefits those at the top, and it benefits those outside the country who know how to navigate it. When people ask why the state reacts so forcefully to certain conversations, this is why. Memory threatens silence. Silence threatens access. And access is the foundation of the post-war order.
Which means this isn't just about the past. It's about protecting the present.
And here's the truth that makes people uncomfortable. You can suppress speech. You can punish leaders. You can criminalize memory. But you cannot permanently stabilize a system built on unresolved loss. Act 4 is about understanding that silence is not peace. It is maintenance. Maintenance of a structure that benefits some, stabilizes others, and leaves the original wound untouched. In Act 5, we're going to talk about what this means now. Not hypothetically, practically, because unresolved systems eventually force a choice. Every unresolved system eventually reaches a limit, not because people rebel impulsively, but because suppression has a shelf life. Nigeria has been managing the consequences of the Biafra War for more than 50 years. Through containment, through silence, through fear, through corruption that stabilizes access for some while exhausting everyone else. And now the question isn't whether this structure is fair. It's whether it's sustainable. A state built on unresolved loss has only a few long-term options. It can continue suppressing memory, which requires increasing force, or it can acknowledge the wound, which requires redistribution, reform, and honesty. Nigeria has chosen the first option for decades.
This is where people start asking, what do you want instead? And that question is usually asked in bad faith, because what they really mean is, how do we keep things stable without changing who benefits?
Healing doesn't look like slogans. It looks like policy. It looks like honest historical accounting, proportional restoration, decentralization that matches economic reality, leadership pathways that aren't blocked by fear of autonomy. None of that requires division, but all of it requires courage.
From a systems perspective, unresolved conflicts do not disappear. They accumulate cost. Eventually, maintenance becomes more expensive than repair.
The global community also faces a choice. European, American, and Asian interests can continue benefiting from a system that trades accountability for access. Or they can accept that long-term stability requires legitimate governance, not just predictable corruption. Extractive convenience is not neutrality, it is participation. And for those of us who are Igbo, and for others living with inherited silence, the question is not whether memory will fade. It won't. The question is how it will be carried, as rage or as responsibility.
Because memory doesn't only destabilize, it can also guide.
I didn't make this film to reopen wounds for spectacle. I made it because systems that refuse to name their past eventually repeat it. Biafra was not an anomaly. It was a warning. Nigeria does not need another war. It needs a reckoning. One that treats truth as stabilizing, not dangerous. One that understands that unity enforced by fear is fragile, and that healing delayed is healing denied. The Biafra War didn't end in 1970. It ended on paper, in bodies, in silence, and in a structure that still governs the present. What happens next depends on whether Nigeria and the world watching it finally chooses to heal instead of manage the wound.